What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily. So with so many smartphones in Samsung's lineup, I think it's inevitable that a couple of them sort of get squeezed out or forgotten. It happened with the A40 somethings. I mean, the A42 was just such an oddball phone that no one knew about, so Samsung had to abandon that tier. The A70 something was also pretty much phased out by both the A50 somethings and the FEs. I just talked about that in my A73 updated review, if you missed that video. And this year, I feel like it's the A25 that's the forgotten phone, which is sort of sad if you think about it, because it really was this tier of A series that was like the catalyst for introducing people to the idea of a bang for your buck budget Samsung. The OG A20, for example, was an ultra-affordable AMOLED phone that wound up being so good and so popular that Samsung kind of had to downgrade the next few A-series phones. But the A21 and A21s the following year, regardless of their downgrades, were crazy popular too. And popular in the US for the first time, really, and those quickly became the budget bangers for a whole new market. However, since then, the A20-somethings have sort of been stuck between a really good, really cheap phone, this year's A15, and a really good mid-range device, either the A35 or the A55, depending on where in the world you live. And this year's A25 isn't a bad phone. It's actually nearly identical to the A35, minus 2 or 3 small things that separate it, but that's kind of the problem. Unless you desperately need to save like $50, there's no reason to get this phone over an A35. And if you want to actually save money, you can get the A15 instead and potentially pocket like $100 or more. What's also especially crazy is that I literally did not know Samsung was selling this phone in the US. I thought this was another A series that was mainly intended for other markets like Europe or Asia. But on Samsung's US website, you can buy this A25 unlocked for $299, which, by the way, you absolutely should not do because a lot of the prepaid carriers are selling this phone for way cheaper. It's obviously available from US Cellular, along with Boost Mobile and Straight Talk. Visible, for some reason, is trying to sell it for over $300, which is pretty dumb. And Xfinity, Best Buy, Walmart, they all have it listed as well. But the point is, if I didn't know this phone was a widely available option, and I mean, covering smartphones is sort of what I do, I can't imagine most anyone else even knows about this phone. And maybe, just maybe, that's purposeful. I feel like we're right on the cusp of a very streamlined Samsung smartphone lineup, where the A20-somethings wind up with the same fate as the A40-something and A70-something. It wouldn't be a bad move, honestly. It's probably needed. I mean, Samsung should really only offer like 5 or 6 different phones at most. That's plenty. And for Samsung, they really just want people buying an FE or an S series anyway. Like, desperately want that. So if they can sort of force it by abandoning some of their smartphone tiers, I feel like they're going to. But it's still sad to see one of Samsung's former most popular devices potentially be on the chopping block when really there's still a lot to love about it. It's back to being a 5G phone with an awesome AMOLED display, decent specs, depending on who you ask, a fine camera, a big battery. I suppose if you want the quick summary though, this phone has the cheaper build, slightly worse processor, and less RAM than the A35, and sort of still feels like a cheap budget device by comparison. So it's sort of a tough sell when the A35, for example, has plenty of great carrier deals and discounts available too. What you're still sort of stuck with though on this phone is that dated looking front display. On the one hand, 6.5 inches is a big screen to work with, but like every single Samsung phone released in the last 5 years has offered a screen this size. And this A25 looks about 5 years old with its selfie camera notch and big bottom chin. My wallpaper disguises it a little bit, and I know plenty of people who couldn't care less about the so-called screen-to-body ratio, but I don't know. To me, it does look a little dated. Around back, like I mentioned a moment ago, this is an all-plastic phone, and while the design still looks exactly like the rest of Samsung's phones this year, including their flagships, it doesn't look or feel as nice as even the A35, which has a glass back, or the A55 especially, which is an all-new build. So you sort of have to decide how important that build quality is. Also, I have like every other fun, funky color from the A series this year, so for this phone, I went with the more subtle and simple blue-black. That's what Samsung calls this. It's like this subtle checkered or crisscross pattern that you can barely see, but yeah, as boring as this might be, it's probably something some folks are after instead of a lime green or a holographic purple. The cool thing about the A25 is that you get two old school features that people still seem to want to have. There's a regular headphone jack at the bottom, and it supports expandable storage via a microSD card. The headphone jack isn't a must-have for me personally. I've been suckered into buying plenty of wireless earbuds at this point, but microSD support is great. You're probably only going to find this phone sold with 128 gigabytes of onboard storage, unless you search far and wide for the 256 gigabyte model. But you can just buy a $20 or $30 SD card from Amazon if you ever need to move some photos or files on over or regain that space, rather than trusting your spicy selfies to the all-seeing, all-knowing cloud. The side-mounted fingerprint sensor, by the way, is also still on this phone, and over the years I've found that especially paired with Face Unlock, it doesn't really matter which fingerprint sensor you get, this or the in-display one, you can get into the phone just as quickly, but maybe some people still feel this physical sensor is more reliable. So one of the craziest things about the A25, in my opinion, is that as long as you can look past the notch and the chin, the actual screen here is literally the same as the A35 and arguably not that far off from even the top-tier Samsung phones. Its 6.5-inch screen is a Super AMOLED panel, the same as the A35 seemingly. It's the full HD 2340 by 1080 resolution, same as nearly any flagship nowadays, and it's a 120Hz high refresh rate screen, also the same as some $1,000 flagships. It's bold, colorful, and bright-ish. It peaks at just 1,000 nits, which is the same as the A35 and honestly a lot better than previous budget A series, which are often plagued by dim displays and plenty of glare. But I'll give you that this screen is still far from bright enough and nowhere near the outdoor glare-free view on a super bright S series. The older glass that covers this display doesn't help the glare issue either, but visually it still looks really nice. It's the exact right sort of colorful and punchy OLED setup that even the least techie people can appreciate as looking nice. It's also sharp, obviously. You don't get anything with a quad HD display unless you opt for a 4-figure phone basically, but it's great to see Samsung didn't skimp out and make this 720p. They've been known to do that on previous phones that would still cost $200 or $300. That's not the case here, thankfully, and they didn't even go with the half step of like 90 Hz, for example, which they almost always do with a phone like this. Now, we all know the difference between 90 Hz and 120 Hz is tough to see, and an iPhone user doesn't even know what a high refresh rate is, but the ones who get it, and 120 Hz on this phone, that silky smooth visual look and much more responsive feel, it's great considering the price tag. For years, I've said that this is about as good as you could ask for even a sub $500 phone. It's what I like to call the trifecta of screen features, and it remains one of the top value propositions for buying a phone like this. The screen should be the most important thing to consider, really, and I think for the A25, Samsung knocked it out of the park. Now, one thing that was oddly omitted from the cheaper A15 was dual speakers, or a secondary loudspeaker within the earpiece up top. This phone, fortunately, does have that. So you get a better, louder, out loud listening experience, which is great. I'm not sure that it's the reason to consider this A25, but it's a reason. And here's a comparison so you can hopefully hear the difference yourself. One aspect of all these A-series phones this year that's been tough for some people to move past is Samsung's decision to stuff their Exynos processors into nearly every single one. This A25 is powered by the Exynos 1280. It's a pip lower than the Exynos 1380 and the A35, and 2 pips down from the A55's 1480. Number scheme and theoretical performance differences aside, so many people have simply sworn off anything Exynos that they're just not going to consider this phone at all. And look, I think if you've had a poor Exynos experience in the past, you're entitled to your opinion. But I've gone on record saying that this is truly a your mileage may vary sort of a deal. For the folks who do a lot on their phone that's performance heavy, especially gaming, I think their concerns and opinions are valid, and there are people who suggest that Exynos processors can't handle even the basic stuff, but that's not really been my own personal experience with this phone based on the usage I suspect most people will try and get out of it, and my own usage too. This is not a top-tier flagship phone, so it shouldn't be judged as one. It's going to stutter from time to time, it's going to be a little slower to launch things. You could make the argument that that's totally unacceptable for any tech device in 2024 and beyond, but I think there are more than a few factors now that impact performance. Samsung's One UI software, for example, or the various third-party apps you might use, or the unique ways in which you customize or modify the Android experience on your phone are all going to impact performance. The A25 is right on the edge between a basic budget device and something people expect to get a little more out of, and this is another reason why I think just getting a higher tier A series phone is way more worth it dollar for dollar. You still only get 4 or 6 gigs of RAM on this if you can find it. On the higher end A series, you start at 6 and can spec up to 8. That makes a difference in my opinion. And the Exynos processors in those higher tier A series are newer and supposed to be better, not just speed-wise, but performance-wise as well. They should be improved with their heat management and optimization. The Exynos 1280 here is more than 2 years old now, so it might be worthy of judgment just based on its age. But like I said, honestly, I still feel like most people are going to be sticking with just the basics on a phone like this. And that's how I view the potential performance capabilities. It's a good casual usage sort of smartphone, and it's one you can theoretically use for a while. Samsung will support up to 4 major Android updates, so it should see Android 18. I know there's some debate as to whether or not updating the phone will slow it down, or if the updates are even worth it on a budget phone like this, but I think they are. It allows you to keep the phone for maybe an extra 6 months or a year longer than you otherwise initially thought you would, so your dollar goes further. There's going to be plenty of people who call a phone like this e-waste in the comments. I know that, regardless of the price per performance ratio that arguably is still pretty good, but I think overall, this is still the essence of what made the A series so good. It's a decently spec'd device for a friendly price tag that's geared towards people who just need a smartphone that can keep them connected to the world. And that's exactly what you get here. One other note on performance, while the 5000 mAh battery inside this phone isn't particularly special, all of the A series have this size battery, it is larger than the smaller S24. And while once again, plenty of people are going to parrot the potential performance woes thanks to the Exynos chips sucking the life out of the battery faster and not optimizing the phone as well when it comes to usage, I haven't ever felt that any of the A series phones this year have been anything less than full day devices. And plenty of people who use these phones sparingly have said they can go almost 2 full days without a plug-in. And on top of that, with 25-watt charging speeds, you can go from 0 to 100% in well under an hour, assuming you bought the right 25-watt charger yourself, since Samsung still stiffs you on that. I don't know, to me, this just is one more reason why I think Samsung's A series is a powerhouse. That big battery feels like a pretty big plus. Last but not least, and I'll try and keep this short and sweet, the camera setup on this phone, while a little better than the previous A24, is arguably not that much worse than the A35 and A55. I mean, the hardware itself is like almost the same. There's a 50 megapixel main lens, an 8 megapixel ultra wide, a 2 megapixel macro. That's all nearly the same setup you see listed on the spec sheet with those higher A series phones. And the selfie camera, that 13 megapixel lens, I think it's exactly the same as what's on the A35. The setup as a whole has everything I consider to be useful and then some. The ultra wide is a must-have. I'm so glad that's now feeling like a default feature for these budget phones. You can shoot in 4K video, which I don't know that many people will choose to do, but it's there, along with the myriad of other little camera features that Samsung tosses in to make this phone feel like you have some things to play with. But like I often say, for as fine as this setup is, it's light years behind what Samsung and Apple and other OEMs push on their flagships nowadays. And I don't mean to state the obvious, but that's where all the time and effort and money has been pouring into those high-end phones. So in turn, that's where you'll feel the furthest behind in using a phone like this. Or maybe not. I mean, look, do these pictures look sort of mid? Yeah, but if you don't take a ton of pictures anyway, may not be a huge deal. And if you aren't some famous cinematographer tasked with shooting a short film or a music video on your iPhone, then most of what you're paying for on those flagship phones that you don't get here, probably money well saved. The most important bit is just that the low level of camera stuff on this phone is still higher than it was even a year or two ago. I just know that if you truly value pictures and videos more than anything else, like these smartphone companies think people do, then you probably aren't considering a phone like this anyway. So in all my back and forths, comparing this phone to the A15 and the A35 and 55 and mentioning the FE and S series and everything else, it just feels like one or two of these phones is unnecessary now. And considering how quiet Samsung seems to have been about the A25, it sort of feels like it's on the way out, right? I mean, Samsung could probably pluck any random phone from their entire smartphone lineup, and it wouldn't really matter in the end. There's a phone on either side that's just as good or an even better value, but the A25 in particular feels like the most redundant and unnecessary A-series device in the lineup. And I think there are way more reasons to justify, well, any other A-series phone over this one, unless you're really getting a good carrier deal on this and all the other A-series phones are sold out or something. I just can't possibly imagine that being the case though, and in my opinion, the A25 is probably the forgotten phone for a reason. But maybe I'm wrong. What do you guys think? Is the A20 something gonna stick around for another year? Is there a specific reason to buy this phone over the others that maybe I missed? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course, especially if you own this phone yourself. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video, or at least found it somewhat helpful. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.